Hello class, this is Dakota Felber. I am doing my presentation on political violence, why it's immoral, and how to stop it. So firstly, we have to define what political violence is, which is fairly straightforward. It is a hostile or aggressive act motivated by a desire to effect political change. And now we have some questions we have to answer. Is political violence perpetrated by governments and violence perpetrated by non-governmental groups the same? Is there a moral justification for political violence? And is it morally correct to intervene in violent conflicts by use of violence? Now, really answering the first question here is going to answer the subsequent two. And you'll see by the end of this presentation what I mean. And so before we can talk about or talk against political violence, we have to talk about Henry David Thoreau and his essay Civil Disobedience, which brought the idea of bringing about political change through nonviolent means really to the forefront of everyone's thinking. And I'll just read this quote. He says, I'm going to shorten it a bit, but you can read the whole thing here. So, in other words, when a sixth of the population of a nation which has undertaken to be the refuge of liberty are slaves, and a whole country is unjustly overrun and conquered by a foreign army and subjugated to military law, I think that it is not too soon for honest men to rebel and revolutionize. What makes this duty the more urgent is the fact that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is the invading army. And now what Thoreau was speaking about here was the Mexican-American War, but his point there at the end, that the country so overrun is not our own, but ours is the invading army, really brings a different point of view to armed conflict. Because really, it's not the case that either side believes they are evil or wrong. It's the opposite, in fact. Both sides so firmly believe that they're right, they end up going to war over that. And so, as a former soldier, often I'd have colleagues and myself at times who would rather leave others be than run off and fight them, yet they went to fight all the same, and thereby submitting their moral will to the will of the government. However, the government itself, which is only the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will, is equally liable to be abused and perverted before the people can act through it. Now, what's important here is where he says the government is the mode which the people have chosen to execute their will. So, if the will of the people and the will of the government are the same, or that if the will of the government is the vehicle through which the people wish to execute their will, then what is separating a government resorting to violence and a group of its citizens doing the same? Well, really, it's nothing. It is a tangible nothing, but intangibly, it is history. As often is said, winners write history books. Now, to give an example we will all understand, revolutions, such as the American Revolution. During this time, the 13 colonies at that time were lawfully under the governance of the British Empire. And so the act of revolution, what they did, should they have failed, would have been treason. However, since the revolution succeeded, it was throwing off the shackles of the tyrannical King George, as is often said about the American Revolution. Sorry about that. Lost my place. And now another revolution that we're all probably pretty familiar with is the French Revolution, where much of the same thing happened in a very similar time period, one right after the other. I think it was the French first and the American second, or vice versa. I don't remember exactly. But should the French citizens who stormed the Bastille have failed, then they would have been executed or imprisoned for the crime of treason. And so it really goes for every revolution. If the revolution succeeds, then it was a just movement overthrowing tyrannical rule. But if it fails, it was only an act of terrorism and violence. And now here is a small chart showing death rates from terrorism. And if you look, the spike maybe around 2015 is 45,000 deaths. And now if you look at this graph, the spike around 2015, it is well over it is just over 100,000. Now this is almost double, and that is only the deaths from, in the red there, is civil conflicts with foreign state intervention. If you were to double all of these numbers up, then the total deaths would be just really insane to think about. And that is a good argument for the utilitarian point of view from this, but that's not the argument I'm making here. And now, since the righteousness of a conflict is decided after the victor is announced, such as in the revolution examples I gave you, then how can any conflict be deemed morally justifiable? And since you can't define the morality of your armed conflict or violent conflict before you commit the violence, then it cannot be a moral thing you've done, because it has a chance of failing, and therefore it will be remembered as nothing more than an act of terrorism or a failed rebellion. And so, really, arguments against what I'm saying here, the main one would be, how do you stop an unjust action of political groups without the use of violence? And now I would point to an old saying, really, to answer this, is the government which governs best governs least. And also that just because an unjust or immoral action is being perpetrated by a political group, as I'm sure everyone's mother used to tell them, two wrongs don't make a right. So if one immoral action is going on and you answer that immoral action with another immoral action, then you just have two immoral actions. So to go back to the governs best, governs least thing, what would have to be done is that government would have to be reduced to its smallest and most accountable state. Now this is because for so long as a government is the moral will of the majority, then the minority will always have to submit their morality to that of others. So then, how can any person be just? For there will be a time when at some point everyone is in the minority on one issue or another. So the only way to stop political groups committing violence is really to get rid of political groups. And that answers, is it, if it's not morally justifiable to commit any political violence at all, then obviously an armed intervention in another violent conflict isn't permissible. And so, I hope you enjoyed my presentation and have a good day.